Chapter 36. Liberation Day 1. Kayla. Vibrations flowed around her. She could no longer feel weight pressing against her or the flow of liquid around her. She felt like she was slowly draining away. It took great effort to draw herself back together. She could tell she was no longer solid. Whatever had become of her was fluid. She increased her density and explored her surroundings through a rudimentary understanding of her own shape in her current gelatinous state. She was in a rounded structure with a hole in the center. There was something rounded above the hole with a shaft underneath it which descended into the opening. After feeling her way around for a while, she came to understand she was in a sink, and the object she was examining was the stopper. She forced it down to protect herself from the likelihood of draining away while she rested. She could sense 5 weak presences nearby. Each felt like her own, yet somehow different. She adjusted her position to get a better understanding of her situation. The others she sensed were contained within smooth spheres. There were 3 other objects with harsh edges and curved surfaces on one side. Was that another orb? It must be. Did that mean the others were more of her? Whatever she was. She slammed 2 of the fragments against one of the spheres over and over until she felt it cracking. She wrapped herself around the sphere and slowly drew the essence from the stone into her own mass. A rush of memories and emotions flooded into her. In a former existence, she was created at a cloning facility to be the loyal defender of a blue-haired boy. She followed his instructions with little will of her own at first. The 2 women who were raising her and her brother scolded him often for treating her like a living doll. A voice whispered in the back of her mind from time to time and sung her to sleep each night until her own personality began to surface. The shadow within her mind rebuilt her psyche night after night, and every morning her blue-haired brother would use pattern magic to reshape the nature of her soul to turn her back into his servant. Over time, she developed an innate resistance to his power, countering every adjustment before it could redefine her. The shadow within her mind could undo everything other than the irrational love she had for him. That was buried so deeply within the core of her mind it couldn't be reached. She knew eventually that the conditioning was broken, but could neither remember how, nor could she remember his name. Her name had been Kayla. With the memories came greater strength and understanding. She thirsted for more, and had 4 more stones to break. She grabbed onto 2 more orbs with gelatinous pseudopods and smashed them against each other, wondering which would break first. One of them felt odd. It was smoother and denser. She was able to sense more of her surrounding as the sound of the clashing stones spread. Her sink was in an alcove. She could sense the locations of the spigot above her, and the faucet was the sort you lift then move from side to side to adjust the temperature. There was a bag by the side of the sink with cord-like handles on top. The stone that felt less dense shattered, its contents splashed onto her and was absorbed swiftly into her mass. The sink wasn't right. She was meant to be in a basin made from biomatter where she could flow freely throughout the weaver's body, but there was no weaver here. She was not part of a greater organism. In the previous Kayla's memories, she had arms, legs, and an assortment of other parts. These memories were very different. She had multiple recollections of being in a viscous state. One was after Kayla had been separated from her body, and her psyche became part of the fluids moving through the eldest of the weavers while she communed with the Ancient One. She found a body and left, full of sorrow from feeling the death of the Queen. She knew the entity known as Kayla had used the plasma from the glowing pools to animate shredded clothing. She wasn't powerful enough to do that in her current state, but if she wanted to leave the sink, she needed to grow stronger. Another vague memory had almost no sensory information until later. 2 bodies melted away and were combined, then the result was pushed through multiple tubes into a chamber where she was gradually restructured. The memory ended with her staring at a clear, reflective surface. The reflection was Kayla's face but much younger. She was immersed in liquid and could not yet move, not even her eyes. It wasn't very interesting, so she set it aside to contemplate the last of the fluid state memories. The most confusing of the set didn't seem related to the girl called Kayla. It included the same tubes from the prior memory, but that's where the similarities ended. In the prior memory, a new person was made from two sources, but on this occasion a single small person was torn apart, turned into a liquid, which was sucked up into tubes or tendrils of some sort. Two faint consciousnesses floated within the shelter of an incomprehensible latticework of energy. The two psyches were pulled apart until they cracked and tore apart like plant fiber. One piece remained while the other melted away. Two signals passed through the void. The first felt somehow female, its counterpart male. No, those concepts had no representation. Perhaps it would be more meaningful to relating it to positive and negative current. The message carried by the more electronic current was confirmation of successful matrix reconstruction at the target location. The biological half of the current reassured her the identity called Kivasa had been transferred out of the core. The robotic signal was stuck endlessly reciting, paradox detected. Transfer failed. The biological, male, signal informed her that the identity called Veshtaka could not be transferred. An unexpected, near-identical matrix with a different identifier already existed within the target receptacle. Both currents were in agreement that the identity matrix known as Veshtaka would be stored for later use. The gelatinous mass which had believed itself to be a girl called Kayla rested. That had been a draining experience, which had thrown her sense of self into question. 3 stones remained. She felt like the last one had awakened more than memories. She could now sense distant thoughts that were not her own, most of them were in languages she could not yet comprehend. She felt like the meanings were just beyond her grasp. She felt herself growing denser the longer she rested within the sink. The longer she stayed still, the harder it became to move. As she shifted her mass, it became clear she needed to keep moving to prevent recrystallization. Taking that into consideration, the harder the stone, the older it was likely to be. She swirled around the side of the sink until she reached her desired density and viscosity. Slamming the hardest sphere into the faucet side of the sink, or even the counter, was unable to crack it. If her assumptions were correct, it must be incredibly old. She gave up and moved on to the next stone. The memories contained within the next stone were difficult to understand at first. It was as if two minds were observing each other in a mirror, while a third watched from the other side, or maybe from within the glass between them. The first was the Kayla identity, which felt like Veshtaka bound together with tree sap and twine. The second was an 8-legged creature which was anxious to supplant Kayla's psyche with its own. As it tried to force the girl's thought patterns into alignment with its own, the third entity, between the reflected psyches, pushed outward until the mirror cracked. From that point onward it became much more clear. She felt mystrionic abilities reawakening within her in the present as the Kayla of the past remembered her suppressed power. She walked through seemingly endless hallways lined with dense metal doors containing eye-level slats. Behind each laid a rotting corpse. They'd forgotten how to think independently after being abruptly severed from a mental collective she had formed. The doors would not open for her. Regardless of her efforts to shove food into their cells, they wouldn't eat. They didn't know how. She spent weeks trying to make them understand, but they weren't capable. They all died, between 10 and 15,000 of them, dead and rotting because of her ignorance and incompetence. Even after closing all the slats, the foul stench seemed to follow her. The station could not purify the stench, and purifying the air in her vicinity with mystrionics was little help. Sometimes she thought she heard them trying to call for help, or claw their way out of their cells, but it was just her mind toying with her. To assuage her overwhelming sorrow and guilt, and stave off the madness growing within her tormented mind, she spent a month repairing the fractured crystalline brain of a Nomdak she called Grax once he was in condition to have conversations. The memory ended months later when she was finally rescued. The densest stone and one other remained. This girl, Kayla, must have some good memories. Maybe one lay in the remaining stones. The mass churning in the sink wondered if they had been this Kayla in a former state of existence. She was the only consistent factor in all the memories so far. The densest stone still refused to break, leaving her only one option. The remembrance it contained was strange. It felt like one of Kayla's memories, but she wasn't in it. The pure black-skinned, silver-haired woman whose perspective it was from was her mother. The entity distanced herself as she tried to understand how this memory could have been Kayla's. Suddenly she understood. The girl's psyche had been displaced and she had inhabited her mother, Valk's, body for a brief time. The entity in the sink immersed itself in the memory held within. Section break. The ground trembled. The barracks groaned and creaked. "No," Valk said as she stirred in her sleep. "Please don't leave us here. I want to go with you. I want to help. Mama, don't go." Another shock wave passed through the building. "Don't worry," Valk muttered in her sleep. "My mother and the rest of the palace guards will protect us. The military will stop the bombers." The sound of shattering stone, splintering wood, and falling steel beams roused her from her sleep. Valk was confused and disoriented. This nightmare had never relented since the day she left her home world, Dayron. It was different this time. The screaming voices weren't calling out in the right language, the sound of the building failing around her was wrong, and the deep rumbling sound of orbital bombardment felt a little different. "This isn't the palace," she muttered groggily as the borders between the dream she'd been having and the reality she faced began to solidify. The planet Aspis was under attack. It was a different planet, a different empire, a new enemy, yet her nightmares had followed her through the stars to this place. Even after 10 years of intensive training, the sound of the rumbling explosions made her feel like a frightened child. "I'm a Shadow Knight," Valk grumbled. "I'm better than this. I'm not her anymore. I'm not powerless. I can do something about this." The rumbling subsided. Valk knew that it wasn't over yet. The enemy was reloading and preparing for their next attack run. She needed to move now, but her feet refused to move, immobilized by the memories of her frightened inner child. The sound of distant bells echoed through the barracks. The enemy had taken out the watchtowers. It must have been a surprise attack. Those bells were part of the backup warning system, to lead them to their rally point. Their forces were being ordered to regroup. She closed her eyes and concentrated on the solemn mournful sound of the distant bell, and it provided her with a moment of solace. All was not yet lost. She opened her eyes, and her fear had been replaced by grim determination. She hadn't died as a child on Dayron, and she would not die here. Not now. She'd come too far. It was time to cast her childhood aside. She was a woman now and one of the elite guardians of Aspis. She would not fail. Valk quickly unlocked her footlocker, grabbed up her duffel bag, and headed through the door. The far wall of the barracks had collapsed during the bombing. The scene before her was truly grim. The city was burning. The tallest of the structures on Aspis had crumpled into ruin. The once beautiful city had all but fallen into waste. "Not again," she whispered as tears began to well up in her eyes. Section break. It became clear as the entity pulled away from the memory. Kayla had taken great pride in her mother's Shadow Knight training which had been passed down to her. Valk had never told her she was there the day the Grand Dojo fell. She's held on to this memory from her mother's mind as a reminder that even the strongest person she'd known had her moments of weakness. The entity in the sink, which was still leaning toward calling itself Kayla for simplicity, realized it had been using Kobe Tamj to provide its mobility thus far and was capable of far more. She harnessed her Kobe Tamj to crush the final stone to dust, and churned and swirled around the edge of the sink until the powder melded into her own mass. This held a memory the old Cletharian queen had shared with Kayla after they finally met. The spider rebuilt her web constantly. Soft vibrations passed through it constantly. The normal vibrations were slow and rhythmic, pulsing in tandem with sounds from the mouth of the other being in the room. When the only other living thing she'd seen entered the room, the lighting dimmed and gusts of air would disrupt the intricate patterns she wove. As time passed, the vibrations began to take on meaning. Her understanding grew each time they spoke to her directly. Her understanding of her surrounding grew. It had a name. It was known as Dvorjon. It had come here from elsewhere in the multiverse. As her understanding grew, her thoughts were affected more and more by its words, and the patterns within her web changed to include runes and words in languages she was beginning to comprehend. Her companion had silvery teeth and claws, golden brown scales, and a red strip of hair from the top of its head, right between its eyes, to the tip of its tail. The one that disrupted her web when it visited was clad in black, and was called Raven Hawk by the one that spoke to her. It sought to inherit the power of her comrade, and was making sure no others would be in the presence of Dvorjon, so there would be no other options. She was unworthy of the armored man's notice. Only the Jani cared about her presence. Her companion was dying and had precious little time left. One day, after Ravenhawk left, the Jani spoke to her, saying, "The future's present to the past, is to be salvation asked. Go now, spider, weaving fast. Link my future to an ancient past. Carry my songs of power back in time, to preserve my ancient rhyme." Everything blurred and, a moment later, she was in a jungle, still resting in the center of her web. All the wisdom and power of Dvorjon was hidden safely within her body and mind. This was the creation of the first Cletherian queen, reborn into a reality adjacent to Keralis, in a time before the first races born to Keralis reached to the stars. The entity which called itself Kayla could feel 4 more pieces of itself, but they were far from here. Constantly moving within the sink was exhausting. With the power at its disposal, and a superior method of containment, she should be able to leave this place. In Kayla's memory of animating herself within shredded clothing, she wasn't in a solid, liquid, or gaseous state. She had assumed the 4th state of matter, plasma. It made sense. She could add more volume without adding mass, which would be useful seeing as her current mass, if solidified, would only be slightly larger than a cue ball. As long as the current continued passing between her charged particles, solidification shouldn't be a concern. She created an eye at the end of a pseudopod and got a better look at the counter. She pulled a damp towel over herself and began adjusting her composition. She climbed out of the sink and sloshed onto the floor, the towel slowly rising up to act as a crude container with an eye stalk poking out from within. She wandered around looking for a less obvious way to contain herself. She found a long gray, hooded, cloak crumpled up on the floor next to a bed. She abandoned the towel as she slithered into the garment and continued converting her liquid mass into plasma. Once complete, she enabled a Mystrionics ability which would allow her to perceive her surroundings without the need for eyes and Kobe-tamed radar sense to broaden her perceptual range. A glowing misty mass of plasma flowed within the hood and upper body of the robe as Kayla practiced maneuvering in this state. It would have been much more difficult had it not been for the memories of doing it once before, but the difference in her container was a struggle at first. The garment hadn't been made for a Terran, but for a being with a thick tail and broad shoulders. She would have to use telekinesis to manipulate objects, and trying to look natural was a pointless endeavor. She didn't have enough matter to simulate arms. She couldn't feel any presences in the hallway. She opened the door and let it close behind her. She felt the vibration of it locking as she made her way to the elevator. Summary. A substantial colony of the insectile beings lived within the asteroid field around the Psi-A's system. Even more had taken up residence in the old Fernib region after the planets were shattered by the death of the star that once stood at the heart of the system. She had no way of knowing if they had killed the nautiloids which bound their hive mind together or were merely defiling each corpse they encountered. The network of thread-like cables which interconnected all living weavers was not present within the Xynon hive. A spherical field encompassed each of the shelled corpses. They felt gritty and painful to Sam's psyche as she drifted while waiting for her queen's mark to fully awaken. The silver cord which connected her body and spirit had frayed and been severed from grinding against the surface of the rival hive mind. The stray threads of Sam's collective came in contact with the minds of everyone who possessed a knack. Some were called to join the choir and became a part of her eternal song, but for most it was just a quiet murmur within the core of their minds. The Zynon hive was only shared by antennae-bearing members of their species. Any who were seen as tainted by contact with other species were either put to death or had their antennae clipped and sometimes cauterized. They were fanatical in their xenophobia and dedication to racial purity. This was their greatest weakness, though they considered it a strength. The Cletherian horde was warring with the Zynon, steadily reducing their numbers and shattering the weaver husks they relied upon as they pushed forward. Samari could feel the weavers within her portion of the Cletherian horde, but the minds of most of the beings within the collective were closed to her, though some she'd never felt before were now open to her. The baby Nautiloid, Louis, and the darklings traveling with him seemed to bow before her will, but her consciousness had been cast adrift with no way to return to her body. Looking down at the slowly turning galaxy of Corallus, she could perceive the froth-like bubbles of the Zynon hives. The bubble near Carmel had burst some time ago. One spiral arm over from her own was the vast sphere of the Exthulian brood mother, which was the false queen forcibly bending Dayron and the insectile races in her path to her overpowering will. On another arm, far across the expanse, there was smaller hive mind which was exclusively darklings connected to a planet by a nearly invisible cord. Two other cords extended from that world. One had connected to a lone weaver near the echelon system, and the other to a collective which was vanishing from one location and reappearing in another. That must be my sister on Erosia, Sam mused. There were a pair of distortions. She deduced one was the Kuloni regional starlink and the other was the Teton stargate. She gently caressed the mind of the weaver which was moving with the Cletherian fleet. They remembered the construction of the megastructures and were using long-forgotten access protocols to access the link network. This was all wrong. She was sure she'd given Carly the right verses. The Horde should be moving from Kuloni Dominion space through the Vork regional link, then return to the Dew-Star Nebula by way of the Havre system. Sam traced the vibrations following through the strand connecting the weaver to the Horde. Carly had changed the last verse completely. What in the powers was she thinking? With cities burned and kingdoms smashed, she must have tried to apply that to the devastated systems in Midnight Fellowship space, but historically that entire region had been Colmeon space. That was the only past that could be linked to. The Colmeon Empire may have vanished from the perspective of the inhabitants of Corallus, but the weavers knew what really happened. The last Jani had banished them to another reality with a set of verses which included the words sealed away, waiting for another day. The remembrance of which lied within the verse, when does break what seemed to be real, the worlds combine, the magic sphere. The Darklings had resolved the discordant verse by connecting it with the empire that previously inhabited that arm of the galaxy, borders between the realms collapse. Samari felt them returning from a layer of reality hidden below Corallus, like a bubble raising up through the oily depths. What remained of the ancient empire had diminished in numbers during their long imprisonment, but the Colmeon collective re-emerged with the psionic ferocity of a Colmeon overmind hungry to reclaim the empire's former glory. She watched helplessly as the cosmic threads connecting the weavers bowed under the weight of Colmea's return. This felt like a nightmare scenario. Her queen's mark wasn't fully part of her yet. She had no way to mend her broken cord, and the limited mental abilities she possessed only worked on beings that weren't considered fully sapient. With any luck, that would make her unworthy of the Overmind's attention. Her consciousness had wandered too far from her body to feel Louis and the Darkling traveling with him. She tied her remaining soul strand to the cord which connected Kivaza to the Nautiloid near the echelon system to keep herself from drifting any further. She shifted the knot closer to the weaver to keep her distance from some Zynon combat groups which were being exterminated in the nearby nebula. She lashed herself to the weaver's psyche to wait out the ripples caused by dying minds. She called out to the nearest group of Darklings and encouraged them to stop pursuing a pair of Terrans in some unimportant ship and defend the weaver which had become vital to her own survival. Once she felt more secure, She looked around for more species like Louis, that were teetering on the border between sentience and sapience. Ujaran. Strawberry, he growled over the sound of her giggles, you can stop now. I'm trying, Cho said as she tried to compose herself. He'd been reprimanded for wearing his 7-layered garb while off duty, then got back to their hotel room to find broken beads in the sink, her bag of clothing knocked over, a towel at the foot of the bed, and his Midnight Fellowship-issued cloak missing. Someone had been in their room while they were out. There weren't any cameras inside the room, so her abilities weren't much help. He was required to wear that robe while performing tasks for the Triad Confederacy. He already told Nevari and had been thoroughly berated for his lapse in judgment. He hadn't told Azuri yet. She already had enough to worry about. The Midnight Fellowship had already broken into its 3 remaining sub-factions, which was a clear indication they were preparing for an armed conflict. Maybe if the Kuloni Dominion upheld its part of the defense treaty. And if they convinced the Lamentics to come to their aid. No, there just wasn't enough time to mobilize a sufficient force. If they went to war, his nation would fall within 2 days even if they could lock down the Titan Stargate. Their only hope was if Kali could intervene and convince Cletheria to oppose an empire they had somehow summoned. The pants he'd purchased were standard for species with wide tails. Cho's teasing might have been amusing if he wasn't under so much stress. All her assless chap's quips and her incessant giggling was infuriating. They do look good on you, Cho said with a quirky smile, I'm just not sure about that skirt belt thing. What's the point of wearing assless chaps if you're just going to cover your bum? It just defeats the purpose. Not that you have that kind of behind. You're more half-assed, with a tail between your legs. He stopped walking and just stood glaring at her. I just can't win today, Cho grumbled under her breath as she continued walking without him. He shook his head and continued walking. He may have downplayed it at the time, but the attack on that Terran with the pink wig was troubling. Erosha wasn't like other worlds. With all the opportunities for a person to sate their secret desires, random acts of violence were a rarity. He kept checking into it, but local security still didn't have any leads. Stopping off to hassle on-duty personnel had already gotten him in trouble once today. The guard captain was right, of course. Ujaran needed to trust them to do their jobs. He could go on duty if he wanted to assist in the investigation, but it was a bit disrespectful to the people that were already working the case. He wouldn't just stroll into a patisserie to tell the bakers how to do their jobs. He'd always approached the special containment area from the east or south. It was harder to spot heading from the north. The hotel across the street from the building completely obscured their view of all but the empty parking lot across from the structure. Cho had been upset that the person who broke into her room had smashed all the glowing stones she'd fished out of the fountain earlier. Ujaran, on the other hand, was relieved. She'd dumped them all in the sink after one cracked and began to leak. It was probably a useless endeavor, but Cho was determined to look for more. Ujaran quietly hoped she wouldn't find any. He didn't know what they were, but rocks don't drip. She was rather graceful in her own way, not like a dancer. She had a way about her from years spent deftly evading customers and co-workers. He caught himself wondering how she moved years ago as he watched her from a half-dozen paces behind her. Cho's pace was slowing as they started passing Carly and Bruno's hotel. The old signs in front had been taken down years ago. Ujaran wondered what they were going to rename it, now that it was theirs. Now that the building wasn't in use, there was no need for guards. The work crew from earlier must have finished for the day. The truck was gone. The fountain was just coming into view. Cho stopped walking just a few paces in front of him. She spun to face him and said, I changed my mind. I think we should get Carly first. Ujaran put his hands on her shoulders, lowered his head to look her in the eyes and asked, What's wrong? She pointed to a camera mounted on a pole at the end of the street and whispered, I can reach it from here. Let's get Carly. She looked visibly shaken. What did you see? Ujaran asked. I don't know what I saw, But it was wearing your robe, she blurted out. I'm going to get Carly. You do that, Ujaran snickered. I'm going to go get my cloak. He was a few steps past her before he heard her start moving again. Freezing when dealing with a possible threat is a dangerous instinct. The same could be said for rushing in blindly. He worked with security. Dealing with some petty thief was well within his skill set. Ujaran was a bit concerned Cho might get in the habit of rushing off to get Carly for every little problem. You don't trim a hangnail with an ion cannon, as they say. It came into view as he neared the corner. A vortex of water reached up several feet from the stonework framing the fountain. The jagged rocks which had been at the bottom were haphazardly stacked on top of the ledge by the force of the churning current. The apex of the spiraling waters was being drawn toward a figure that seemed to be his cloak, as opposed to simply wearing it. 3 tiny glowing spheres spiraled in front of it, as the liquid transitioned into a more gaseous state and flowed into the distorted mass within the cloth. Ujaran stood with his back flat against the side of the building. His knack for mystrionics was rated so low, it didn't even register on some tests. There was no way he could even compete with the sort of power he was witnessing. He'd heard of top-tier abilities which could give false life to the classical elemental forces. They could create small golems from stone, which could function as mindless helpers, or water wraiths which took the caster's form and were able to follow rudimentary commands, but this was far beyond a bit of mystical puppetry. His stun stick and combat training were grossly inadequate for dealing with a situation like this. Unless Carly could do something to help, he resigned himself to letting it keep his damn robe. The most he could do alone was ask it nicely to return his property. He shivered involuntarily as the hooded portion of its form turned toward him. A 4th sphere floated within the glowing bulbous mass behind the smaller spinning orbs. The water sank back into the fountain, knocking some of the stones off the ledge as it slowly settled into place. One by one the orbiting stones shattered as they approached the bulk of the thing's form within the shadowy folds of fabric. The glow brightened noticeably as the contents from each sphere was absorbed. The arms took a more substantial shape as the process continued. The single sphere at the center of its head-like mass remained intact. A ghostly blue mist flowed from beneath the robe and out of the ends of the sleeves as it began moving toward him. He felt it reaching into his mind, but couldn't understand its thoughts or intent. It felt like there were multiple simultaneous thoughts emanating from it. His tongue's ability translated spoken words, not whatever that was. Feelings of intense rage, anguish, and fear flowed through him as it slowly drew closer. I don't understand, Ujaran said nervously. Neither do I, Carly said as she walked past him. Her voice startled him. He hadn't heard her or seen her coming. She stepped out in front of the apparition. She was wearing the kimono robe, with her tails wrapped around her. She didn't look like she expected a fight, which set his mind at ease. Kayla, Carly asked, that is you, isn't it? How are you here? A ripple passed through its form. That's not good, Carly said irritably. Let's get off the street before you attract any more attention. Follow me. We'll talk inside. Ujaran stood motionless as they both walked past him. He followed far behind them as they walked around the side of the building. He could see strange rippling distortions within the mist flowing out of the cloak. I said inside, Carly snapped. I'm not discussing this in public. Bruno held the front door open for them as they all walked into the old former hotel. Where's Cho? Ujaran asked as he walked past him. She is securing the uplink, Bruno said with a shrug. Do you want me to show you around while the ladies talk? The ladies. Ujaran snickered while he watched Carly and the cloaked monstrosity step onto the elevator. Yeah, sure. A tour sounds good. Carly. Until Strawberry showed her a camera feed of what she'd seen by the fountain, Carly had forgotten all about the 10 stones she'd hidden in the fountain. Not Real had selected which stones to take and which to leave. It was instructed to only feed on unneeded memories to sustain it during its journey. Once it returned, she intended to direct them to the fountain to get 5 more, but Not Real never returned. Carly wanted to give her sister Soul a fresh start, free from all the trauma of her former life. Her shadowy accomplice had done its job well. The entity standing before her was mostly an amalgamation of traumatic memories. The gym teacher's attempt to attack Kayla, losing control and brutally murdering her grandmother, Tina Gorin, and traces of the horrible assignments PRI had sent her on were among those reclaimed from the fountain. There was one interesting bit in there, though, that even Carly didn't know about. Her initial lifespan was long enough to choke a leech. Maybe that was how La Barth had expected her to kill Corin. The life force that thought it was Kayla couldn't survive too long in her current state. The energy sustaining her was slowly dwindling. She was never meant to exist, not like this. Kivaza? Kayla asked. How is she? Is she happy? Her means of communication was interesting. When the original Kayla was young, she used a mystrionic ability to simulate telepathic communication with her brother. They referred to it as mind-speak, but it actually functioned by causing slight vibrations of the recipient's tympanic membrane. This iteration of Kayla was using both telepathy and mind-speak simultaneously. The latter sent ripples through her misty form. I don't know, Carly answered sadly. She was, but I haven't heard anything since the surgery. They only expected Sam to be out of commission for about 10 hours. It's been twice that and nothing. Once our connection is fully secure, I'll be able to check, but I think something really did go wrong. More wrong than releasing Colmia? Kayla mocked Colmia. What? Can't you feel them? No. I've been bracing myself for the awakening of Sam's Queen's Mark. I don't know what effect it will have on me. They just let me out of confinement. I'm not going to give them an excuse to put me back in. Then don't let them, Kayla scoffed. I prefer sticking with targeted killing sprees, Carly snickered. I've heard rumors indiscriminate murders are frowned upon on some planets. Colmia doesn't uphold that ideal, and the Cletharians have a long history for purging inconvenient populations, Kayla mocked. They walked off the elevator onto the second sub-basement level. The prior floor was just a wine cellar and was accessible through the bar area. This level could only be reached with the main elevator. Carly wasn't sure what the intended use of the area was. It was a large empty area with large evenly spaced support pillars. Carly planned to convert the floor into a furnished training area. Can you join me in my mindscape? Carly asked. I'm not sure why you're even asking. Kayla's form quivered in amusement. There's nothing normal about you. Don't you have to focus on maintaining your form? Carly laughed. Do you even have a brain? The crystal in my head functions a bit like one, Kayla said. You make a good point though. My native form is a bit drippy. It would probably be better if I had a container just to be safe. A bowl or flower pot should do the trick. I'll go get something, Carly said as she pressed the elevator call button. Wait here. I'll be right back. Pick out something pretty, Kayla seemed excited. The door reopened. A pretty vase for the horrifying incarnation of anguish, Carly snickered as she stepped onto the elevator. Got it. I said a bowl, Kayla said angrily. Vases are too narrow. While ownership of the building was being transferred to Lady Darkseid, Carly learned that the property was forfeited to Dominion Central Bank after the financial collapse of the hotel management company. Other than the removal of perishable items, the structure was much as it had been the day the hotel was shut down. Carly grabbed a large wooden salad bowl and headed right back to the sub-basement. They got themselves situated in the middle of the chamber. Kayla's phantom positioned herself above the bowl and adjusted her form, shrinking as a portion of her mass congealed within the bowl. Carly established a telepathic link with her visitor and drew their fragmented psyche into a basic mindscape. Even within the mental construct, Kayla's form was indeterminate. They worked together to build a rudimentary map of the galaxy for the setting of their discussion. They adjusted the positions of the nearby star systems by reaching out with their linked consciousnesses in search of high concentrations of minds. There were a few anomalies Carly noticed. First and foremost, the Xynon colony within the nearby nebula was almost non-existent. She could feel the last few survivors wailing in confusion and terror as one by one each of them was severed from their horde. While focusing on Samari, Kayla and Kivaza were tugged in two different directions. As Kivaza reached her destination, Kayla's phantom was launched beyond her, like a stone from a slingshot. Samari's ethereal form motioned to the nautiloid she'd tethered to with a sad look on her face. While unable to directly add Sam to the mental link, she was able to connect using the Weaver to bridge their minds. "Where are you?" Phantom Kayla asked. "I'm with Samari," Kivaza answered. "No, you're not," Kayla balked. "I'm looking right at her. I like the new body. I'm standing right her with." Kivaza fell silent, realizing Samari's soul was tethered to the Weaver. "My cord broke," Samari said. "Why is there another me here?" "Your memories, soul, or whatever you want to call it, was stored in 20 stones, Kivaza chuckled. Not real brought half of them to cyanide. Do the math. Wait, so does that mean you could have made 20 new versions of me? Sam asked. Of course not, Kivaza said. You're the one who told me the more intense the emotional connection is to someone, the stronger the cord is. Look how thin your cord was. You don't have a strong enough sense of self. That's probably why Shinji's cord broke. We fixed that. We can fix you. How? Samari asked. I'm a collection of your missing memories, Kayla said. I'll just use them to stretch out, reinforce, and mend your connection to your new body. You're a manifestation of her past trauma, Kivaza objected. I wanted to give her a fresh start. Sam doesn't need the memories you have. I'll be the judge of that, Sam said irritably. We're not just defined by what makes us happy. Did you ever stop to think your incessant desire to protect me might have been holding me back? How many of my memories did you hide from me? I'll take care of it, Kayla said. I have all the memories we hid from you. So, you two are we now? Kivaza grumbled. Fine. I'll go deal with the Colmians while you two are playing with your shuttle. A spinning wheel would make for a better analogy than a loom, Samari argued. I think she's jealous, Kayla taunted. Kivaza suspected there wouldn't be much of her visitor left once this was all done. She wished she could think of another way to save Samari. This would likely change her fundamentally. Hopefully, the worst moments of Kayla's life would perish with her phantom. Kivaza reluctantly pulled her attention away from the echoes of her sister soul. The Colmion Overmind's forces were currently in a standoff with Cletheria and needed to be dealt with. The Horde might recognize her as the Queen's successor, but she needed their trust. Section break. Within her mindscape, Carly could perceive dense cables extending from each of her brown tails. Her black tail was connected to something, but it didn't feel right. Then again, the only nautiloid in that area had been lobotomized by the Xynon. She remembered the extreme fanatical loathing not real felt in response to the defilement of the Weaver. Kivaza had envisioned a better way. A path to allow the Xynon to coexist alongside her collective. Weavers didn't live forever. Some went mad as they neared the end, and had to be silenced to maintain the integrity of the tapestry woven by their song. Whether it was the reluctance of the Xynon hive or Kalani's refusal didn't matter anymore. She could feel Kayla and Samari through the mental link as they worked on restoring Sam's connection to her body. She sensed that Samari knew why the hairs at the tip of her black tail felt so strange. The Darklings were in the process of exterminating the Xynon. All 3 Cletherian citadels had deployed their fighters. They were so numerous Kivaza couldn't even approximate their count. They had positioned themselves between Colmia and the Teton Stargate in a vast arc-shaped formation. The Colmion fleet consisted of ships far too large to be jump-capable. She couldn't gauge which force was superior militarily. She knew nothing about the ship's offensive or defensive capabilities. What she did know was that the Colmion Overmind and their minions were attempting to impose their will on the Cletherian collective. Colmions had the strongest psionic affinity of any species. Despite their stark numerical inferiority, they were holding their own for now, but once she took her place at the heart of the collective, that would change. She'd been in the position of struggling against a rival hive mind on 3 occasions in the past. Twice unsuccessfully against far superior Cletherian collectives. This time she'd be the one with superior numbers, but she couldn't afford to underestimate them. The Colmions weren't reliant on the web of interconnected nautiloids like other denizens of Corallus. Targeting weavers could turn the tide, but if they weren't willing to be reasonable, she could arrange for another Cheshire party fleet and end them. Kivaza wasn't entirely sure about the plausibility of the latter, but she needed to accept it as true so her opponents would believe it if they managed to find it in her head. She was unsure which language to think in. Bestial was tempting, but she wasn't fluent yet. They were unlikely to respond well to Terran Common. There was a lot of bad blood there. The Lamentics and Eldorani also had a history of long bloody wars against the old Colmion Empire. She smiled to herself as she decided to try the oldest language she knew. With any luck, they'd be able to understand the language of the Val Kren Gen O. Carlise focused on the pulsing rhythm of the Cletherians' song resonating deep within her. She refocused her eyes to better visualize the flow of energy through the intricate latticework which not only bound the collective together but also extended to the throngs of people throughout Corallus. She didn't draw their minds into herself this time. She matched their words, sliding between the gentle pulses, as she was drawn into the core of the collective. She could feel the ripples from the Colmions' attempts to disrupt the flow of thoughts and intents. She felt conflict as she attempted to exert her own will. 2 visions with indeterminate sources passed through her mind. The first was a flock of birds riding the wind, the second a school of fish sculpturing the currents. There were so many creatures that swarmed, moving as one. She'd given some thought to it before, but never quite understood the connection. The horde had been moving like insects swarming here and there, following the movements of the weaver and citadels. They had no real cohesion. They lacked the sort of unity Kivaza and Kayla had struggled to maintain. Trust, acceptance, and consistent desires were the key. She opened herself up to them, letting their will flow into her, while struggling against her fears of being consumed by it. The Queen may be the heart of the collective, but what good is a heart without a body? It may be vital, but it's still just part of a greater whole. Left alone, any single part was just a useless hunk of meat. If she was the heart, the weavers were the brain, the cathedral her arms, the fighters her hands, and the not real would be who knows what. The analogy was incomplete, but it helped. Kivaza stopped maintaining her own self-visualization as she felt her queen's mark becoming active. She felt the border of the Cletherian group psyche harden as she embraced her place among them. She could still feel the pressure of the overmind pushing against her will, or the combined will of her collective. It was becoming progressively more difficult to pinpoint the border between the two. The power differential was dramatic, but she was unwilling to let her guard down. The raw power at her disposal was immense, but her lack of experience was highly problematic. Talk or fight, Kivaza's thoughts flowed to the rival collective in the ancient language of the Val Kren Gen O. As a precaution, she transmitted images of the Jani pictograms which most closely matched her meaning. That species is gone, yours will be soon, the overmind responded in a different language, but coupled their thoughts with pictograms from the same language she had. Kivaza suspected the overmind was attempting to threaten her directly and didn't expect the Cletherians to understand their language or the images included with their thoughts. They failed to understand that any delineation between them had dissolved almost completely, and what any species within the collective knew was known to the whole. The entirety of Cletheria answered in a singular voice. Hunters fall upon the meek, for all of life, death shall seek. ancient power and lordly might, cannot withstand the time of blight. Those upon the battlefield did not know their fates were sealed. Instead of a fourth verse they chanted in unison as the horde opened fire. Shadows pass beyond the veil, and battles wage with tooth and nail. Shadows pass beyond the veil, and battles wage with tooth and nail. It was just as Baron Delaric had described. The fighters rotated in tight circular patterns to prevent their beam weapons from overheating. It was as if the Colmeon fleet was in the center of a collapsing star. Had they returned just to be exterminated once and for all? Had they really thought threatening Cletheria would go without repercussion? The horde stopped firing a moment after it had begun. The number of Colmeon ships had diminished by roughly 1/5. Many of the surviving vessels were damaged. Talk or fight, Kivaza repeated. There was a strange lull. It was not so much a pause in their song, but a quiet rhythmic laughter that chilled her to the bone. She struggled against the distraction as she wondered who the real villain was. Colmia, Ruku Ha, the rival queen, or was it her? We're all villains in the end, aren't we, young queen? The Overmind thought to her directly. They'd found her mind within the collective during her moment of reflection. It's all a matter of who's telling the tale. She instinctively wanted to shield her mind from the Colmeon, but that would cut her off from her own collective. Her mind eased, as she felt Samri's consciousness gliding into the collective alongside her own. There was an odd quality to the thoughts of her sister soul, but she could tell both Queen's marks were now active. This was not the time for analysis or contemplation. Is that two queens, I sense? The Overmind mused. He may be sensing the Exthulian, Kayla cautioned the sisters. Our little trinity shares a soul. I do have a rival, Kivaza answered with caution. Is that why you broke the seal? The Overmind inquired. There was a smug manipulative feel to their thoughts. You think I will help you in some grand conflict? What could possibly motivate me to do that? We are Colmeons. We neither bow nor yield. A Colmeon bowing, Kivaza laughed. You're cephalopods. I don't even know what that would look like. Nor will you. The Overmind's racial pride and defiance were undeniable. Their continued existence would always be a threat, yet Kivaza had the impression they preferred to move in secret, using the other species as pawns while competing among their own for power and influence. They were like petty nobles, all trying to usurp the current lord. I don't want that, Kivaza thought dismissively. If not that, what do you want? The Overmind's thoughts felt more like accusation than inquiry. I'll be honest if you will, Kivaza thought forcefully. She knew the Colmeon collective wouldn't wither or retreat. The truth bears a price, young queen, the Overmind mocked. Be sure you can pay it. I didn't intend to release you at this time, Kivaza confessed. You keep calling me a young queen. New would be more accurate, but I'm not the sort who would seek the annihilation of another species for a minor transgression. Those Terrans fed us a life form that resembled our young, without our foreknowledge, the Overmind raged. I would not call that minor. I remember, Kivaza mocked, but there can be no future if the past is all we're able to see. Bringing you back now was my error, and I bear that responsibility. The ancient Terrans faced the consequences for their actions. Those who followed are not their ancestors, any more than the Kitalma Martian, Lamentix, or even the Colmeons are. I don't care for threats, as you've seen. I'm willing to leave you to your own devices provided you're willing to accept a few simple conditions. She could feel the unified fury of the Colmeon collective, and tell they were preparing for a counterstrike. Condition 1. Let go of the past and look to the future. Kivaza spoke through the weavers to anyone willing to listen. Judge others for who they are and what they do moving forward. There was no response from the rival collective, but she had the impression they were at least listening. Condition 2, Kivaza continued, learn to work with the younger races. Enter negotiations with the Midnight Fellowship. There are several recently emptied systems that were once part of your empire. Once you're able to come to a mutually beneficial agreement, I will withdraw. I will not interfere with these negotiations. What's your third condition? The overmind asked suspiciously. I only had 2 in mind, Kivasa admitted, but if you want, I can come up with more. The Colmians powered down their weapons. Weaving forward each strand cast, linking future to the past. That verse originated from Samari. Kivasa had no idea why she chose that one, but the Cletharians stopped swarming and pulled back into a more defensive formation which seemed like progress. Samari and Kayla had developed a method to form a parallel link using Mystrionics and Kobe Tamj. They were now able to maintain the mindscape without need for psionic abilities. Kivasa's assistance was no longer needed. The overmind was a formidable psionicist. If Kivasa hadn't been fortifying her own mental abilities with Kobe Tamj, the confrontation would have gone very differently. Keeping that in mind, her sister's connection to the collective would likely be more secure without her. Kayla could use her telepathy to speak on behalf of Cletharia if needed. Tug my tail if you need anything, Kivasa thought. She slowly withdrew her psyche, leaving her sisters to keep watch. Kali opened her eyes, but wasn't ready to disconnect her telepathic link with Kayla. That poor wretched Echo held so many memories of pain, betrayal, and hatred. Kali hoped to spare Samari from all that, but the only clear choice was to return some of those memories to her. They should have waited to conduct the surgery until Sam had built up enough memories that were distinctively her own. The real question was which memories had they used? The phantom had shrunk to half its previous size. Why was it so hard for her to trust them to decide which of their own memories were necessary to make Samari whole? Back when Kali was Veshtaka's dark counterpart, she existed just to defend her alter ego. Even with a body of her own, new friends, and the start of a new life of her own, she felt the biting sting of her own hypocrisy. She'd made a grand display, with flowery words, urging Colmia to move forward and let go of the past. But why couldn't she? I don't know if you can hear me, but Ujaran is going to need his cloak back. I hear you, the phantom mind spoke to her. I wish I could be there when you see what that mutation core did to our baby Nautiloid. I understand why they call them weavers now. It was instrumental in giving her the pieces of me she needed. A memory from her mother, and one from the former queen. Thank you, sister, Kali said sadly as the glow within the robe continued to fade. Goodbye, sister, the last vestiges of Kayla mind spoke weakly. Kali sat with her until her form collapsed into the wooden bowl. After retrieving Ujaran's robe, what remained was a spherical crystalline latticework, with a dimly glowing blue crystal at its core. The width of the intricate structure matched the interior of the bowl. Judging by its size, the centerpiece was the same stone which had stood in place of her head before. Kali wondered what was so precious she couldn't bear to part with it, yet important enough to entrust to her sister. She put on Ujaran's robe, carefully picked up the bowl, and made her way back to the elevator. She brought Kayla's strange gift up to the penthouse and placed it by the window that got the best light. Not for any particular reason. It just felt right. Kali stared at it, glistening in the sunlight. It was hard to believe something so beautiful came from a thing of such despair. She focused on the stone, trying to reach the memory it held. It felt familiar. Was this really one of Kayla's memories? It wasn't dark or dour. This was a memory both of them had experienced together. A bizarre moment, displaced in time, after Veshtaka had been split into 2 bodies and her twin soul divided between them. A moment when their present selves stood before Veshtaka's father in their bodies from the past. She didn't need to probe deeper. She remembered it herself. Section break. Kaila, Edikoneg said with a smile. The word has an interesting sound. Is that what you call yourself in the future? Kivasa blushed. That sounds close, but the pronunciation is a little off. It's Kayla, Veshtaka said, putting extra emphasis on the A sound. Excuse my sister's ignorance. She doesn't know the elder tongue like I do. That's not our name, but I wish it was. The name Kayla is from the Dareth tongue. Its origin has long been forgotten, as with most Terran names, but it means keeper of the keys. So, the sound is like the title of the leader of Dayron, the Day, Edikoneg said appreciatively. Kayla. His pronunciation was spot on. That's it, Veshtaka said happily before turning her attention to Kivaza. Why do you wish we were called Kayla? What does it mean? Oh, and I assumed we were speaking the Elder tongue. Wasn't that the language of the people of Elderos? No, what we call the Elder tongue was an ancient trade language developed so the Jani and Shaki could talk to each other, Edikoneg explained. The Eldarin Empire adopted it out of necessity, but only for interracial negotiations. The Jani are able to see sound waves, so it's nearly impossible to speak their language properly. If you can't see the sounds, you can't understand the nuances. Either you learn the Elder tongue or risk offense. Oh, Veshtaka admitted, that does sound more complicated. What does Kayla mean? There's no direct translation, Kivaza said with a grin. There never is, Veshtaka smirked. I guess you could say it means quiet joy, Kivaza tried to explain. It's when the heart is full and has no more need to want. Section break. That's how Cyan makes me feel, Kali said wistfully. I hope Samari finds her own way to feel Kayla someday.